So I'll just open it up to the floor, and I don't know who, if I don't actually recall now who's in what group or that, but in terms of thoughts, suggestions that evolved in your conversations, if someone would like to share from their group.
I'll jump in if that's okay, Cornelia. While it's fresh in my head, there was a lot of talk and it was lovely. There were people from Ireland and people from abroad as well. So thank you for the opportunity to chat with other action researchers around the globe. It's really one of the benefits, I think, of online. I think a lot of our conversation was around sites and the way physical sites have changed because of the pandemic, and just that idea of sites on Zoom changing the way we conduct discourse, and that some people are a lot more comfortable, and some of the researchers seem to have gleaned a lot from being online and being on Zoom, while others find it very challenging because they find there's a lack of richness there, and the online site or space doesn't allow for the informal discourse that happens when we're meeting in the same physical space. Somebody was talking about trying to make meaning of silences on Zoom. And I think we've all experienced that and the difficulties of that. We were also talking about the idea that the site, and looking back to Stephen's slides, the interplay between the site and the discourse. So, two different parts of the architecture meeting. And that I was kind of saying, I think sometimes some people get a lot more from an online interaction than others. And I often find that, not to be too basic or simplistic about it, but I find young people seem to be able to get a lot of meaning online in their social interactions, while other people really like to have that face-to-face chat. And so it's kind of interesting looking at the interplay between those two architectures and the way COVID has changed those.
That's great. And yeah, the transgenerational even conversations that are occurring in some cases too. Would any other group like to share their comments? And I'll also say, so sorry if the access to the Google Doc wasn't there for everyone, but it should be, please write in the Google Doc. It's just to kind of maintain a record and to continue the conversation after we leave Zoom. David, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, thanks very much, Cornelia. So we had a really good conversation about perhaps how the theory of practice architectures and thinking about the practice arrangements, that sort of made us think more deeply about what was really shaping our practice as action researchers at a particular site. And what were, to what extent, if we've been at a different site, a different institution in a different country, what the different type of research we could have done and what would have been possible. So it's about possibilities and limitations as well. So we found that powerful, really. We also talked about the idea about learning and learning to practice different. And we were all able to come up with some examples or to start thinking about some examples of how our practices as action researchers evolved as a result of doing action research. And, hopefully more progressive, more inclusive.
Great, thanks, David. I see Karen's hands up, and then I might ask Stephen if you wanted to comment on some of the comments. Karen, you have your hand up.
Yes, we found the talk very, very interesting, but we had a little bit of difficulty understanding the questions and spent a lot of time thinking about what the definitions of site were and learning. And one of the things that we found very interesting was thinking about architecture. I started thinking out architecture was structures. And then we started thinking about architecture as being a sense of living somewhere, which was very different and gave us a new insight into thinking of sites. And we talked about the collective visual concept and how that related to what we did in action research. And we also talked about ourselves, the 5 of us, as a learning site for the second question, and our relationships and how we related together and the context. And we felt that site in particular was indivisible from action research. You couldn't really do action research without having grasped a concept of site and the context of everything that we did. So if anybody else from my group wants to add anything, please do.
Yeah, Stephen, would you like to come back in on to comment on any of the items that were raised there? I don't mean to put on the spot or anything.
There are many, but one thing I'd like to say is that if I was starting in 2008 again now, I don't think I'd call them practice architectures. But unfortunately, after 15 years or whatever it is, I can't escape because I get it that the architecture seems like to design, seems fabricated, etc., etc. And I think if I'd been using the concept of niche better, that would have been more helpful. But I do believe that architectures are created by people, they're not just given. And so we should think of architectures as living things, not just as static, dead things. But I wanted to say how they channeled us through passages and rooms and things like that. And I think our practices are channeled in those ways.
Thanks, Stephen. And yeah, it actually reminds me also of the term that Bill Penuels talks about, or some of the educational designers in terms of infrastructures to Tara and
Good, yeah.
Tara, I'll hand over to you.
Hi. Yes, we had a really interesting discussion with Noor and Richard and Mariette. And we too, like Karen, had a bit of discussion over what the questions were really asking and what they mean, particularly the second one around learning. But with relation to the first one, when we talk about sites, we ended up discussing a lot of the power relationships in terms of the relatings in certain sites, and how particularly educational sites, universities, schools are very much set up with those power relationships built in. So they're inherent in the teacher-student interactions, and how I guess trying to equalize those in some way, whether that's in the classroom every day when you're teaching in order to develop a more co-constructive or online co-constructive relationship, or whether it's undertaking research with students as co-researchers. How, can we ever truly get to a point where we are truly co-researching? And Richard was talking about his work with students from a different culture, Chinese students, no, international students, I think, and how there were different approaches to, again, those power relationships, and how, again, it was complicated to encourage everybody to co-construct if that wasn't culturally the norm. And I'll stop there. I've said enough.
No, thank you very much, Tara. I'll hand over to, I'm trying to keep to the time and agenda, so I sorry for speeding things along at all, but Trail, your hand's up next.
Thanks, Cornelia. Just in brief, we had a lovely discussion as well, to be honest. We had a couple of hard hitters in our group. Mary and Bernie, Clive and Zul were in attendance, but in brief, really, for question one, it struck us all that really, you may be plowing away in your own action research, but there's a whole lot more to it. The architecture needs to change around it too. You may be able to change your practice, but there's more involved, and the context is an important part of that. Mary referred to an interesting, just to tie in with the analogy of the river, she said that maybe the ground may not be fertile enough for change. For question 2, there were a couple of references as well to the literature from Mary, Eric, Fromm. So the idea of that you are an action research all day, every day, and from Dewey, that we learn from reflecting on experience was referred to too, but it may not be core to people's practice day by day, as Clive said. And, you know, people might be on autopilot, as Bernie said, and overwork and burnout is a factor as well. So we need to be perhaps aware of where other people are on site with their own practice. So that was kind of where we came from with it all, more or less, I think.
Brilliant, and thanks for all your comments in the Google Doc and for noting that. Maria, your hands up.
So our discussion was based primarily around the site-based perspective as well. And the 5 of us in the group were primary teachers at some point, either now or previously. So we spoke about the different sites within different schools and the different classrooms and how they can be so varying. And similar to the last group, we spoke as well about the culture within our sites and whether there's the support there for changing practices, or, you know, whether it's between staff or management. Just how it's so important to get opportunities to change practices and be supported in this. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then Siobhan in our group, keeping in line with the tango idea that Stephen spoke about earlier, she said that it takes 2 to tango, and spoke about the importance of the opportunities to share these ideas within our sessions as well.
Well, thank you very much, Maria. Stephen, I'm going to again put you on the spot. I don't know if you want to say anything just in concluding.
In closing.
Yeah.
The one thing I think I'd like to say about the site and the question about the site is that if you think of theorists of practice like Pierre Bourdieu, he thinks about practices happening in fields. They're cultural fields, economic fields, social fields. And those fields are filled with capitals, and people have more or less of the capitals in those fields and so on. But these are abstract ideas. And one of the things that I've been really impressed by in the practice theory of Theodore Szatzky is his emphasis on the site and what actually happens and what is in the site. The material content, the cognitive content, what people are talking about, the discursive content of the site, because the things that are brought to the site or found in the site, those are the things that make practices possible. And the emphasis on the site is to say practices aren't shaped only by these abstractions about discourse or whatever. They're the language we speak here. They're the way we do things here. They're how we relate to each other here. And a good practice theory, in my view, has to be willing to deal with the concreteness of what's found in the site and to look into the site to see what things are there that you can change as well as have to work around, you know. The conversation could go on for hours. I'm so delighted to have been part of it, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be here and to have responses to these ideas. It's just wonderful for me. It's good action research for me.
Thank you. Katrina, did you want to just say, oh, you're muted. You're just unmuted. Yeah.
A big thank you to Stephen for getting us all going on the topic and learning new things this morning, and to the group I was in particular. Thank you again, Stephen, for being with us today.
Yes.
Thank you for having me.
Rich conversation to have on a Saturday morning. It really, yeah, I see hearts popping up. It's heartwarming, and it is just a lovely presentation. Thank you very much, Stephen.